huge work in progress. But let me start with what narratives are usually good for. So when we think about narratives, what pops into our heads is usually stories. So we can think of them in terms of entertainment. We have a lot of fictional stories that are available to us in terms of books or movies, series. Narratives are also good for learning languages. Usually when we start learning a foreign language, we start with some basic grammar structures, but then as we further develop our abilities, we get to develop also our ability to produce narratives in that language. And we have to develop also reading comprehension into that specific language. Narratives are also good for cultivating norms. Usually all of cultures have proverbs or fables in which we kind of pack moral messages into a narrative structure because it's easier to recall rather than simply stating a norm. What else these are good for? They're useful in communicating with others. When we talk about how our day went, we will communicate it in terms of a narrative. So I woke up and then I did that and then I did the other thing and so on. They're also useful for sharing experiences. We write autobiographical novels or we simply share our experience in writing or even in pictures or silent movies. So why a narrative and why this should be thought of in terms of a narrative competence? So narrative is a term that has throughout time resisted definitions, but for clarity, I'll refer to a narrative not to a story, where story would be the content of the narrative, but I will refer to it in terms of a structure, which can be used and reused for different stories in order to connect characters, actions, events, goal-oriented behavior, and reasons for acting. Some definitions of narrative include a sequence of two clauses which are temporally ordered such that a change in their order will result in a change in the temporal sequence of the original semantic interpretation. This was Lavov's definition. Herman is actually tried to come up with a minor change and arguing that actually it's a spatial temporal sequence that might change the original semantic interpretation, but I did not include that. Another view is that at least two events must be depicted and there must be some more or less loose but non-logical relation between the events. Crucially, there is a temporal dimension in narrative. Also, there has to be a sustained temporal causal relation between particulars, especially agents, and I will get to talk about those causal relations a bit later. A narrative is distinct from what it is a narrative of. This was Goldie's point, which is a very important one. Stein's definition of story emphasizes a goal or directed episodic structure, and Brunner defined personal narrative as discourse that functions as a pragmatic intention to assert information about self. That may not always be the case. So Brunner is also saying that narrative is conceptual reconstruction of experience. And following Brunner, one can argue that narrative is the first form of discourse produced by children. From a developmental standpoint, it can be considered a discursive unit of two or more contiguous and thematically related utterances, referring to two components of an event occurring in the past or future. But this is going to depend on how we actually conceptualize narratives. So we can have language-based narratives, or we can have non-linguistic narratives. Some would argue that non-linguistic narratives are actually some sort of primers of narratives. So why narratives? Because they seem to be the best way we account for our experiences and how we make sense of them. because there's been a lot of talk about ChatGPT in the last couple of weeks. Perhaps I should also mention that the primary way that we seem to engage with others is narratively based, but not necessarily language based. Being able to use language in order to produce a narrative, it's easily computable. That's not fairly complicated to do. However, producing a narrative from our experience is a rather complex thing to do, because we have to use several other mechanisms that do not necessarily depend on our ability to produce language. However, developing language abilities does seem to help us make better use of narrative practices, which can lead to a better ability to make sense of others. Stories also have an intrinsically temporal nature. This is consistent with Abbott, who argued that constructing a narrative pertains to having the ability to time travel or for temporal navigation. This allows narrators or readers to move across sequence nodes in narratives. Narrative comprehension, storytelling, and narrative engagement are considered features of human intelligence, according to Engel, and the storytelling skill is based on the ability to mental time travel. Again, there's a lot of emphasis on the ability to mental time travel and to the temporal aspect of narratives. Children start to tell stories at the age of 5 or 6 and start to engage in stories around the age of 2. Humans are deemed to be the only species fond of narratives, and this is usually believed to be related to their linguistic capacities. If one thinks of a narrative as a sequence of connected events, the ability to engage in such sequences can be separated from language, since the sequence can be conveyed through different media: silent movies, picture sequence, symbol sequence, sound sequence. According to Hogan, a narrative is a causal sequence that refers to a social practice. So here we would have a special kind of a narrative. It can be implicit, non-linguistic, or explicit linguistic. Dethan argues that there are transactional narrative formats among non-human animals, and narrative competence is based on pre-verbal narrative formats in children as well. According to Rubin and Greenberg, individuals with little to no linguistic abilities can still engage and interpret, understand, or grasp the reasons that narratives are actually based on. And there have been various studies conducted with aphasics and that deemed results which showed that the ability to process non-linguistic narratives is still there. So they cannot process linguistic narratives, but they can process non-linguistic narratives. So this is where I try to explain how this relates to the idea of theory of mind or mind reading abilities, or making sense of other people's reasons for acting. So there's this question: do narratives shape how human process other minds, or do they presuppose an existing theory of mind? One's relation, there are several views, so we'll just go through all of them, and I'll try to see where my view is different. One's relation to other depends on a cognitive device that allows for the representation of the other's mental states, their sufferings, plans of action, intentions. It's just this type of mechanism that allows humans to acquire a system of moral values and aesthetic preferences. This was Ricoeur's view. Humans everywhere interpret the behavior of others in mentalistic terms because we all come equipped with a theory of mind module that is compelled to interpret others this way with mentalistic terms as its natural language. It is hard for us to make sense of behavior in any other way than via the mentalistic or intentional framework or attribution of mental states is to humans as echolocation is to the bat. It is our natural way of understanding the social environment. Both the classic view of theory of mind and the inactivist view consider the role of narratives in social cognition, but they do so in opposing ways. So classic approaches deem narratives to be relevant in theory of mind deficiencies, such as the inability to produce narratives is linked to ASD. Narrative impairments are a feature of autism spectrum disorder. People with autism spectrum disorder tend not to integrate the thoughts and emotions of the characters in the story. However, it is assumed that mental state attribution is necessary for understanding and producing narratives, and ASD is deemed to be the cause. There is some sort of innate module that is not functioning correctly, that leads to the inability to process narratives and further raises issues in a theory of mind abilities. And activists argue that narratives actually help us engage with others. They mediate our interactions and help us make sense of their reasons for acting. In terms of accounting for ASD, here we have the exact opposite explanation. So people with ASD present these traits because they do not process narratives. Thus, it is not the case that we have an internal module responsible for our abilities to engage with other minds that's improperly functioning. What we actually have is this inability to properly engage and process narratives. So, but this becomes fixable. It is something that it is an ability that can be developed beyond the developmental stage. It's something that even adults can expand. So let's go through all of them and see. But I don't think that we should actually try to find an explanation in terms of fully inferential terms or in fully inactivist terms. I know this is something that some are resisting to, but I think that it might be useful to try to understand which abilities are innate and which are acquired, and how are we actually engaging with others in terms of disabilities, because I think narratives play an important role in all of those views. So a full account of theory of mind should actually account for our ability to comprehend and produce narratives. So in theory, one theorizes about the other person, employs a theoretical stance in order to understand the other's mind, like a child scientist. Of course, it's an oversimplification, but for the sake of time, I'll just try to briefly go into all of them. Simulation theory one does not theorize about the other person, but instead uses one's own mental experiences as an internal model in order to understand the other's mind. So I simulate the feelings I would experience if I were in the situation of the other. Theory of mind module, different modules that help us attribute beliefs to other people. It's like a specialized component of social cognition. Then we have folk psychology, which we talked about extensively yesterday, versus the narrative practice hypothesis, about which Hero talked about yesterday as well. So with theory, there's how do narratives fit into that? Well, theory assumes that we come up with actually real theories about how other people act for reasons. Now, what a theory would entail is that we can generalize those principles and apply them to most of the contexts that are similar to that one. And this does not always seem to be the case. For example, if we go to the airport and we are actually waiting for someone that we haven't that we have never seen in real life, but we have like an idea of how that person is supposed to look, right? We are going to see someone waving at us, right? So if I were to derive the principle that someone waving at me means that it's signaling something to me, I could somehow generalize that and say, okay, so that's the person. But there are multiple reasons why persons could wave. So just using extracting a generalized principle from that might not work in here. So the best way, I think, to make sense of such situations is to come up with a narrative understanding of what's happening there. Simulation theory does not actually come against the idea of using narratives to understand other people, but there can be, of course, more understanding others narratively is a rather complex task. So it's entails doing multiple other things. So the most basic form might entail some sort of a simulation at a basic level. So I can look at the facial expressions. There can be intersubjective ways of interacting with others that are emerge prior to our ability to derive or to produce narratives that will help us make sense of other people's reasons. But this could be complementary. So now producing narratives and making sense of other people's reasons with those narratives can be complementary to simulation theory. Now, the biggest problem seems to be with the theory of mind module, because the theory of mind entails that there's some sort of specialized component of social cognition. And if this is the case, then if we have an innate predisposition to engage with others, and at some developmental stage, we simply the full module simply comes online, and we are able to account for social cognition, then there's no role for narrative practices. But I think there's a way to go around that too, and the way to do that is to simply consider the ability to produce and to comprehend narratives, either a different module or just another manifestation of the same module, but with a different function. Perhaps it might not be the best way to go about it, but it could be. So I'll just try to explain the way that narrative practices are important for the inactivist views. Storytelling has various functions for Huda, not just entertainment. Stories are what we use to share experiences, to make connections with others, build trust, construct nerves for emotional connections. They also have normative functions. Narrative practice hypothesis is based on the idea that storytelling practices ground our ability to make sense of ourselves and others in terms of reasons, not my reading. He assumes that we are not born with the ability to make sense of others' mind or our own minds, and deems the modular theory of mind hypothesis his most important rival. However, simply assuming that the ability to ascribe mental states is not innate leaves open the possibility for other models such as theory. Huda argues against theory, and so does Gallagher. Narratives provide the way we come to make sense of actions done for reasons. And theory holds that we use folk psychology as some set of rules that we apply to explain the actions and mental lives of others. The rules are what make it a theory. Here's where Huda introduces his distinction between narrative versus causal understanding. So there's this quote: narratives and theories provide fundamentally different means for achieving fundamentally different ends. Theory is enlightened by focusing on what is abstract and law-bound, whereas narratives cast particulars in certain light to reveal the significance of what happens and why. For these reasons, general theories are simply non-narratives at all. Another view is that loose links between intentional states and subsequent action is the reason why narrative accounts cannot provide causal explanation. But the kind of narratives that are useful for the narrative practices should be, according to the complex linguistic representations that describe a particular temporal sequence of non-logical related events, at least more than one, but usually a whole bunch. The event sequences that narratives describe can be real functional. Another view is the interaction theory, where we don't need to have an understanding of other minds before engaging in meaningful interaction with others, because action comes first. And we start out as participants in a setting populated with other acting entities. By learning narrative practices and language, we engage in folk psychological ways of thinking about one another as persons. there's also those quotes from the two most important inactive views. So there's the idea of narrative competence that suggests an alternative to dumb approaches and a better way to account for the more sophisticated understandings and misunderstanding we have of others. And I completely agree to that. There's also the idea that there's a good deal of evidence that humans have from infancy onward direct perceptual access to the intentions and feelings of others in their embodied and situated comportment. Our primary way of understanding others is worked out not via third-person observation or first-person simulation, but by a second-person real interaction in pragmatic and social context. So, as I previously mentioned, I'm not going to come up with a solution or to a response to what narrative competence actually is. It's just rather an assumption, as I mentioned, it's a work in progress. So my idea is that what we should do is try to make sense of how we interact with others by also accounting for how we come to actually be able to engage in narrative competences. And we should understand what the cognitive prerequisites for narrative competence are. And probably we should do so without fully committing to inferentialist view or a fully inactive view. So the best way to make sense of it in my view, is to simply try to figure out what mechanisms are innate that help us produce narratives and help us comprehend them, and which abilities are actually acquired. So what does it mean to actually be able to use narratives to make sense of other people? How can we produce them? How can we make sense of narratives? So the earliest narrative-like attempts of very young children concern the recent past experiences. So by the time children are 5 or 6, they may be very proficient at telling both personal narratives and elaborate fantasy narratives. But they also seem to engage in pretend play, or they can talk to imaginary friends. So they seem to somehow be practicing and prepping for this major ability to produce narratives. And they practice by routines and play and reminiscing. And the role of the caregiver seems to be very important in here. So by routines, I mean simply going to sleep at a certain hour, or eating and noticing how this actually unfolds. So we have an event that is made up by several sequences. So someone sets the table, and then they bring the plates, and then the food, and then this is going to be routine for lunch. So I would say that this is actually non-linguistic narrative, but it has a major role in further developing a narrative competence that's more complex and language based. There's also play. When we engage in playful behavior with other children or dogs or whatever other pets or dolls, we also somehow engage in a form of nonverbal narrative. I mean, babies can use utterances and those utterances can suffice for them to understand that that sequence of events as a single narrative episode. But that is because I believe that the prerequisites necessary for narrative competence are dependent on organizing experiences into units. So before we develop the ability to produce stories or to understand them, we have to first be able to sequence our experiences into smaller units. And then we have to bind the experience into coherent units. which makes it easier for us to remember them. It seems that we do have a predisposition to actually account for what we experience in terms of a narrative, but we can only test that when we have the ability to talk. There's no way to look into that without it. And then we need to have episodic memory. Without it, we cannot have narrative competence. And there are also other abilities that seem to co-develop with it, like making future projections or labeling. So this might become accessible in a situation in which similar cues or sequences of events occur, so we can recognize a narrative. All these point to other important abilities, for example, planning or making identity statements. I used to be this, or I used to be that, whereas now I am something else. They're useful for norm formations, or for, I think, also for learning new concepts, because there's no way to actually, that's why I said that narrative competence is also important in learning other languages, because we need to get the background information about the concept that's introduced. We cannot simply learn a definition for it and work from there. So arguing that social cognition is entirely inferential or inactive tends to rather close lines of inquiry in as opposed to opening more and helping us make more sense of how it is that narratives play such an important role in our lives. So that's about it, but probably I'll just explain more in the Q&A section. Yes.
All right. Thank you, Sandra.